I'm Neil Woods from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Organised crime exists completely because of drug prohibition. It has always been about how to facilitate the illicit market. Of course, organised crime spreads into other criminal activity. In fact, according to publications from the National Crime Agency, the money from the illicit drug supply is reinvested into other forms of criminality. In other words, general criminality, organised criminality, such as people trafficking, is made possible by the huge value in the illicit drugs market. Now, because we've been trying to maintain this drug prohibition for so long, what's happened is policing drugs creates monopolies in organised crime, and that happens both regionally, nationally and internationally, because police more often catch the low-hanging fruit than they do the people at the top. And quite often, organised crime groups use the police to actually get rid of the opposition, the competition, I should say. So often a police informant is used to shut down the competition, and that helps the monopolies grow. Now, what's happened over time, of course, is police are actually very good at catching drug dealers generally, and what's happened recently is that that's meant that the organised crime groups, the regional ones, will exploit children to do the drug dealing for them, both transporting the drugs between cities and also as being the point of sale. Because kids are more disposable, they're easy to manipulate, but most importantly, those children are not as easy to infiltrate with the use of police informants or undercover cops. So in other words, the tactic of using children is a response to police tactics. It's actually a result of police success. The monopolies, the gangs from bigger cities taking over the supply in smaller towns and seaside towns, that's not new, but the use of children and the increased use of children is new. We have seen the tip of the iceberg so far, because it doesn't matter how many county lines that we shut down, how many 23-year-olds running 10, 15-year-olds, or it doesn't matter how many of those groups, those gangs that we shut down, it's not going to have any impact, because it's a very good strategic response to the police tactics. So it's going to grow. Because you catch those gangs, it doesn't impact on the people who make the most money from it. And in fact, County Line's system creates a buffer zone, really, between the police and those people. Yes, of course, police will have success here and there and catch people who they may be able to sell as being the big fish, the person in control, but it won't really impact on the market at all. So my rather depressing prediction is that County Lines is going to get much, much worse. And trying to police it harder is actually going to be counterproductive. Regional organised crime groups recruit their children from a variety of sources, but one of the ways that they recruit is they will ask a child, are you in care? Or they will ask them, have you been expelled from school? Now, they'll ask them because they're the kids that might be hanging around the streets. And those are the two groups that they primarily target. But of course, there has been a growth of urban street gangs as well. Gangs of youths who, just by virtue of the postcode that they live in, or some other kind of affiliation, they call themselves a gang. The organised crime groups also recruit from those pools of people. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate the significance of these urban street gangs, because you see in the newspapers, gangs of youths are behaving terribly and causing all this social nuisance and involved in crime. Well, I wouldn't want to overstate that these are organised behaviours from these gangs. You know, these gangs aren't like Los Angeles, they're not wearing gang colours. It's just it's a loose affiliation, and these affiliations change. And the interesting thing in regard to two gangs who might be theoretically in opposition to each other, the organised crime groups don't care about that. They will recruit County Lines kids from any of these gangs, and these children may well find themselves working together with people who they're supposedly in opposition with. So the OCGs, the organised crime groups, don't really care. They will groom their children from anywhere they can make contact with them. The kids that are recruited for County Lines, they are recruited often because they've been expelled from school. Now, if you consider that a black kid is 3 times more likely to be expelled from school than a white kid, then it's clear that those children are more likely to be recruited into county lines. Now, if you put that into the wider context of how black people and white people are treated in terms of the impact of drug policy, it gets even worse. So, for example, a black person is 8 times more likely to be stop searched for drugs than a white person. That's despite the fact that black people don't use drugs more than white people. In fact, there is some evidence that white people use drugs more than other racial groups. Now, once a black person or a white person is then arrested and they go through the custody process, they're in the police station, they're in the cell, and the custody sergeant has to decide whether they get charged to court or they get a caution. A black person is 4 times more likely to get charged to court than a white person who's more likely to be cautioned. Then once they're in court, in the dock, waiting to be sentenced by the judge, a black person is 4 times more likely to be sent to prison than a white person. Now, I was never so good at maths at school, but that is clearly exponential racism. Now, you could argue that we have a fundamentally racist society, and this is no different. Well, you would be right. We do have a fundamentally racist society. There are various data that shows that. But it's far, far worse for drug policy. Because if a black person is compared with a white person in terms of being sentenced for any crime at all, a black person is twice as likely to be sent to prison than a white person. But it's twice as bad for drugs. It's twice as bad for drugs offences. So what our drug policy is doing is embedding and accelerating the racism in our society. So if you think about that poor child who is being exploited to do the drug dealing for organised crime groups, for the gangs, they're picking on the black kids because the system picks on the black kids. Of course, an important aspect of how they recruit as well is through the teenage cannabis market. Teenagers can get hold of cannabis far easier than alcohol, and they do. It's the drug of choice for so many. But it's organised crime which runs the supply, and so these children come into contact with gangsters because of the teenage cannabis market. Now, apart from the fact we shouldn't be allowing our children to have such easy access to cannabis, we really should be protecting them from the contact with organised crime. So that is one route in which children are groomed, but they can be groomed in really vicious ways as well. So, for example, a child is given half an ounce of cannabis or an ounce of cannabis and told to bring the money when they've sold the drugs. The gangster will then, quite often, fake a robbery. So he gets 2 of his mates to put a knife to the throat of the child and steal the drugs. A terrifying instance for the child, but it's all for show, it's all theatre, because the child then goes back to the gangster and says, "I've had all the drugs stolen." And the gangster says, "Well, that's not my problem. You still owe me the money." And the child will say, "But I haven't got any money." So the gangster will say, "Well, you can work it off for me. I'll need you to carry these drugs." And they're given a lump of heroin or crack cocaine into 10 or 20 pound deals in a long sausage shape, and then they have to plug it. They have to put it in their rectum to transport it from one city to another. And that's how they work off their debt. And in fact, there are instances in the grooming and manipulation of children where the plugging, the actual process, is filmed so that then there is footage held by the gang. The threat, of course, is if you continue to work for me, or that goes on YouTube, or that goes on social media, or wherever. And that's a very real threat, and it's part of the grooming and manipulation process in the exploitation of these children. It's often debated what is the reason for the rising violence amongst youth. And I would say it's almost entirely because of drug policy. I have great sympathy for people who say, no, it's actually about poverty, it's about lack of opportunity, it's about a lack of things for young people to do. Yes, all of those things are important, of course. But why are they becoming more violent? And why are so many people involved in urban street gangs who also get involved in county lines? Why particularly are they getting more violent? Well, this is how it comes down to drug policy. Police are good at catching drug dealers, as I've said elsewhere. They are. But they catch the low-hanging fruit more than anyone else. But it creates a situation where the most important tool in the police box is the use of information, the use of police informants. But if you can be so terrifying that you're not going to get grassed up because people are scared of informing on you, then you are the successful drug dealer. So the incentive is there not only to become violent, but also to create a reputation of violence. I know it's not every gang which are involved in drug dealing, and it's not every violent teenager who is doing it because they're involved in drug dealing. But we have had decades now where the reputation for violence is an important way of gaining respect and staying alive on the streets. That really has come from drug policy. It's changed the way teenagers behave because the dominant people in a peer group or the dominant people in a community of that age group have become those successful drug dealers. It's a Darwinian situation. The ones who survive are the most aggressive by reputation. That is reflected in youth culture of that age group, certainly in urban areas, in a very widespread way. It's drug policy as it stands is completely changing how our young men, and it is made primarily young men, how our young men grow up in our cities. I'll give you an example. When working undercover in Leicester, I met a 16-year-old who was dealing heroin for the gang that I was infiltrating. Now, when I first met him, he was actually really likeable. He was a cheeky, funny 16-year-old. 6 months later, he was an absolutely terrifying 17-year-old who would use casual violence towards me. He would barge into me, he would hit my head into a wall. Because he was developing his technique, he was developing his reputation. That his companions, his gang members, insisted he did that because collectively they didn't want a weak link in the chain. They didn't want one person who could get grassed up because that could bring the whole lot of them down. He had to follow the team ethos, and the team ethos was to become terrifying. And I saw him change, and it was a really tragic thing. But he's only one example. AB was his nickname. But AB is only one example of what's happening right across the country, what's happening across the world wherever prohibition is. It's changing the shape of our youth. And that's where the gangs are coming from. Of course, the logical answer to all this seems very clear to me, because these things only happen because there is a drugs black market. If you regulate the drug supplies, you will end the exploitation of children.